Do you know who I am? I donated $4 million to this building. I will have your badge pulled before your shift ends.
That's your right, but you're still not coming through this hallway.
She wasn't supposed to be alive. That's what the men in the black SUV thought when they drove past the hospital that morning. But they were wrong. And so was the billionaire who had just made the worst decision of his life. The ICU never slept. Monitors beeped in steady rhythms. The air smelled like antiseptic and quiet desperation. Nurses moved fast and said little because in this unit, a wasted second was a stolen life. Nadia Osei had worked this floor for 6 years. At 31, she was the one the younger nurses called when a vein collapsed, when a family broke down in the hallway, when a patient coded at 3 a.m. and nobody else knew what to do. She was the calm that held everything together. She was also 7 months pregnant. Her feet hurt. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, grinding ache that started around hour 4 of every 12-hour shift. But she never mentioned it. She simply rubbed her belly once between rooms, took a slow breath, and kept moving. None of her coworkers knew much about her life outside the hospital. She didn't talk about where she grew up. She didn't mention family. When people asked, she smiled and changed the subject. Nobody knew. Nobody was supposed to. Nobody knew that the quiet nurse adjusting in 4-line in room 6 was the foster sister of Devlin Cross. Wait, not that name. His name was Kai Morrow. And Kai Morrow did not work in hospitals. Kai Morrow did not attend charity galas or appear in Forbes lists. He moved through the city like a current beneath still water, invisible until the moment he decided to destroy something. He was the most feared man in the Pacific Northwest criminal underworld. His organization had no official name. His face appeared in no police database. He had kept that world entirely away from Nadia for years, not because he was ashamed of her, but because she had asked him to. Let me be normal, she had told him once when they were teenagers. Let me just be a person. He had honored that. Always. But peace, as it turns out, has enemies. The double doors at the end of the hallway slammed open at 2:14 p.m. Every head on the floor turned. The man walking through them wore a steel gray suit that cost more than most nurses made in 3 months. His name was Bryce Fontaine. He was 44 years old, the founder of 3 tech companies, and a man who had never once heard the word no without consequence. Behind him, a nervous assistant held a folded cloth against Bryce's left palm. A small cut, the kind you got from a broken glass at a restaurant, the kind that needed a Band-Aid, not an ICU. Bryce didn't know that, or more accurately, Bryce didn't care. He scanned the unit like he owned it, which, in his mind, he nearly did. His last donation had funded the hospital's new cardiac wing. He had the framed letter from the board to prove it. I need a doctor. Now. His voice cut over the monitor sounds. Not a resident. Not a student. A real one. A young doctor named Trevor hurried toward him, hands out, voice low. He tried to explain, this floor is critical care. Sir, your assistant's injury is minor, the main ER is 2 floors down. Bryce grabbed Trevor's coat and shoved him sideways. The whole floor stopped breathing. Bryce stepped forward, heading toward a room where a 67-year-old man was recovering from open-heart surgery. His eyes were scanning for an empty bed. A nurse he could command. Anyone who would just do what he said. Nadia stepped out of room 6. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. Bryce stopped walking. His jaw tightened. He looked at her the way powerful men sometimes look at people they've already decided don't matter. Like she was furniture that had mysteriously started talking. Do you know who I am? His voice dropped into something uglier. I donated $4 million to this building. I will have your badge pulled before your shift ends. That's your right, Nadia said. She didn't move. But you're still not coming through this hallway. Something shifted in his face. The controlled anger cracked, and something colder came through. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather card holder. He flipped it open and held it toward the young doctor who had pressed himself against the wall. Write me a number, Bryce said. Whatever it takes to move one of these patients to another floor. I don't care which one. I need this bed. Trevor's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Nadia spoke instead. Put that away. Her voice didn't shake once. Money doesn't change which patients are stable enough to be moved. The man in room 4 had open-heart surgery 11 hours ago. He cannot be relocated for a hand cut. Bryce turned to her slowly, the card holder still open. "You're a nurse," he said. And the way he said it made the word sound like an insult. "You don't make those calls. On this floor?" "I do." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Bryce launched into it, loud and ugly and relentless. He called her incompetent. He said her scrubs looked like they came from a thrift store. He talked about her education, her salary, her place. He said things that made the young nurses at the station look at the floor in shame. Nadia absorbed every word without flinching. She turned toward the wall phone to call security. That was when Bryce hit her. The sound of it was wrong. Too sharp for a hospital. Too loud. It split the quiet of the ICU like something breaking that wasn't supposed to break. His palm connected with the side of her face with full force. Her head snapped sideways. The clipboard in her hand dropped and hit the floor. She stumbled back, one shoulder catching the edge of the nursing station counter, and her hands flew instinctively to her belly. Both of them, wrapping around the curve of it, protecting it. She didn't fall. But her eyes closed for a second, and that second said everything. The floor was silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind that follows something irreversible. A young nurse named Priya stood frozen at her station, both hands pressed to her mouth. The security guard near the elevator had his hand on his radio but hadn't moved. Nobody had moved. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the building. Bryce straightened his jacket cuffs. "Maybe now you understand how this works," he said. Down the hallway, near the exit stairwell, a tall man in a black coat stood with his hands in his pockets. He hadn't moved since the doors opened. He had watched the entire thing. The shoving, the threats, the slap, the way Nadia's hands went to her stomach. He had a small tattoo on the left side of his neck. A wolf's eye, half open, staring forward. He didn't pull out a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He took out his phone, typed 4 words, and sent them. Then he walked out the side door. Dr. Holt arrived 60 seconds later. He was the chief of medicine. 62 years old, silver hair, a reputation for staying calm in catastrophic situations. He walked in, surveyed the scene. Nadia still steadying herself against the counter, Bryce standing with his arms crossed, and made his decision in under 3 seconds. He chose wrong. "Mr. Fontaine." Dr. Holt moved toward Bryce with his hand extended, voice smooth. "I am so sorry for this. Let's get you taken care of immediately." Nadia stared at him. He didn't look at her. Not once. Bryce rolled his shoulders. "Your nurse was aggressive and obstructed patient care. I defended myself." Dr. Holt nodded like he was hearing a reasonable weather report. He didn't check the cameras. He didn't ask the witnesses. He didn't look at the red mark spreading across the face of the pregnant woman 10 feet away. He turned to Nadia, and his voice went flat. "I'm going to have to let you go. Effective immediately. Please surrender your badge and clear your locker." The shock hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Not the words. She had half expected the words the moment Holt walked through the door and didn't check on her first. It was the witnesses. The nurses and doctors and security guards who had watched Bryce Fontaine slap a pregnant woman in the face, and were now staring at their shoes. 2 security guards walked her out. Not roughly, but firmly, like they'd been ordered to make it look official. She handed over her badge, emptied her locker into a paper bag, walked down the long main corridor past the patients she'd cared for, past the break room where she'd eaten hundreds of lunches, past the room where she'd held a man's hand while he died because no family had come. The front doors opened. Cold air hit her face. It was raining. She stood on the wet sidewalk and pulled out her phone. There was already an email from a law firm. Bryce Fontaine was suing her for emotional distress and professional interference. She read it twice. Then she started walking. The next morning, her card was declined at the grocery store. Her accounts were frozen. Bryce's legal team had moved fast. When she got home, an eviction notice was taped to her door. She sat in the dark apartment and put both hands on her stomach and breathed slowly until the shaking stopped. She had left her old life because she wanted something clean, something earned, something that was only hers. She had built it over 6 years. Shift by shift. Patient by patient. Now it was gone in a single afternoon. She held that reality for a long time. Then she stood up. She went to her bedroom closet, moved a stack of boxes, and found the fireproof case behind them. Inside it was a phone she had charged once a year, just in case. Just in case had arrived. She dialed a number she had memorized a decade ago. Kai Morrow answered on the first ring. He already knew. He'd been in the hallway. He had seen the slap in real time, watched her hands go to her stomach, watched the chief of medicine choose a donor over his best nurse. He had walked out that side door not because he didn't care, but because Nadia had made him promise years ago that he would never act unless she asked. He had spent the last 22 hours waiting. When her voice came through the phone, quiet and broken at the edges, he closed his eyes. "I need help," she said. That was all. "You don't have to say anything else," Kai said. His voice was the calmest it had ever been. "Go to sleep. I'll handle it." He set the phone down on the glass table of his penthouse office, looked out at the city lights below, and made 4 calls. By morning, Bryce Fontaine's problems had already begun. Bryce found out at dinner. He was at his private club, dark wood, leather chairs, the kind of place that didn't have prices on the menu. He'd ordered 2 bottles of something obscenely expensive to celebrate the fact that a pregnant nurse had been escorted out of the building where he was supposed to be apologized to. When he placed his card on the tray, the waiter came back 2 minutes later with the look of someone who wished they worked literally anywhere else. Declined. Bryce snatched the card, called his banker. 6 missed calls already on his phone. His company's stock had dropped 19% in the last 3 hours. His offshore accounts, 3 of them in jurisdictions specifically chosen for their privacy, were empty. Not withdrawn. Just empty, like the money had never been there. Then his head of security got a text message. Bryce watched the man read it. Watched the color drain from his face. Watched him put his phone in his pocket, stand up, and walk out of the club without saying a single word. Bryce sat alone at a table with 2 untouched bottles of wine and no way to pay for them. He spent the night trying to hire people to fix it. He had names. Dangerous ones. Men who had made inconvenient situations disappear for important people. He met the first one in a parking garage at midnight, slid a bag of emergency cash across the hood of a car, and showed him what he'd found in his mailbox when he got home. A black envelope, sealed in dark red wax, stamped with the image of a wolf's eye. The man looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then he pushed the money back, got in his car, and left. The second fixer didn't even sit down. He saw the seal and shook his head before Bryce finished speaking. The third, a man with a badly broken nose and a reputation for taking cases nobody else touched, looked at the seal, looked at Bryce, and said quietly, "You hit someone you shouldn't have touched. There's nobody in this city who will take this job. Not for any amount of money." "Why?" Bryce demanded. The man looked at him with something between pity and revulsion. "Because whoever sent that envelope doesn't negotiate. He just collects." Bryce drove to his private airfield at 2 a.m. He had a jet. He had cash. He had a plan. Get out of the country, get to somewhere without extradition, rebuild from there. He was 50 feet from the steps when the headlights hit him. 3 black SUVs, appearing from the dark edges of the tarmac like they'd been parked there for hours. Which they had. 6 men stepped out. No weapons visible. No raised voices. They simply took his arms, put a bag over his head, and drove. When they removed the bag, Bryce was kneeling on a cold marble floor. The room was enormous and almost entirely dark, except for the light at the far end of a long table. Sitting there, with a cup of tea and an expression of complete calm, was the man from the hospital hallway. The wolf's eye tattoo was clearly visible on his neck. Kai Morrow set down his cup and looked at Bryce Fontaine the way someone looks at a problem they've already solved. Bryce's instincts defaulted to aggression. It was the only tool he'd ever really had. "I have connections at the federal level," Bryce said, his voice cracking slightly. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Kai slid a tablet across the table. It stopped directly in front of Bryce's knees. On the screen was the ICU security footage. Full resolution. Time-stamped. It showed everything. The shove, the screaming, the slap, Nadia's hands going to her stomach, the guards walking her out, Dr. Holt nodding along like a man being told good news. Bryce stared at it. Kai said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You thought she was alone." His voice was quiet enough that Bryce had to strain to hear it. "You thought nobody was coming." He leaned forward slightly. "She has me." A lawyer stepped out of the shadows with a stack of documents. Kai explained the terms without emotion. Every asset, the company, the properties, the vehicles, the patents, the emergency cash that was already burning in a barrel in the corner, transferred immediately. Every penny was going into a legal trust for underprivileged single mothers in the city. The donation was structured specifically so it could never be reversed. The gym bag of cash Bryce had brought to the airfield had already been collected. Bryce sobbed through the signing. Real tears, the kind that come not from guilt, but from watching power leave your hands forever. When he was done, the men put the bag over his head again. They drove for 20 minutes. When they pushed him out of the vehicle, he hit wet pavement and rolled twice before stopping. He tore the bag off his head and looked up. Hospital emergency entrance signs. The same building. He was in the parking lot where Nadia had stood in the rain, holding a paper bag with her belongings, freshly fired from the only job she'd ever loved. Bryce Fontaine sat in the rain with nothing but the clothes on his back. And then the police cars came, because while he'd been sleeping in alleys that week, Kai had sent Bryce's financial fraud records to 3 separate federal agencies: tax evasion, embezzlement, wire fraud. 10 years of it, documented perfectly, delivered anonymously. The officers stepped out. Bryce didn't run. There was nowhere to go. The morning sun came through the large windows of the private suite on the 7th floor. The room was warm and quiet. Flowers on the windowsill. Soft light. The sound of a newborn breathing. Nadia held her daughter against her chest and looked out the window at the city. Her daughter had her grandmother's nose and a full head of dark hair and lungs that had announced her arrival to the entire floor. She was perfect. Kai stood near the door with his hands folded, looking at his niece with an expression Nadia had never seen on his face before. Something open, unguarded, human. He had bought this hospital 4 months ago, quietly, through 3 shell companies. The board didn't know who owned it until the paperwork was finalized. Then they knew. And then Dr. Holt had quietly resigned, which turned out not to matter because the new ownership had already begun processing his termination. Holt was currently employed 2 floors below. Not as a doctor. The janitorial team had been short-staffed. As Nadia watched her daughter sleep, she heard the squeak of a mop bucket in the hallway. She glanced up. Through the open door, she could see him, older-looking than she remembered, moving slowly, eyes down. He passed the doorway. He looked in. He saw her. He looked away immediately and kept walking. She didn't call after him. She didn't need to. She looked back at her daughter's face. Kai crossed the room and stood beside the bed. He looked at the baby for a long moment, then at Nadia. "You good?" he asked. She laughed. A small, real, tired laugh. "Yeah," she said. "I'm good." He nodded once. Like that settled something he'd been holding for a while. Downstairs, in a federal holding facility across town, Bryce Fontaine sat in an orange jumpsuit on a metal bench. The wealth was gone. The legal team was gone. The investors, the board, the club members who had laughed with him over champagne. All gone. He had spent 44 years building a life where no was a word other people said. Not him. He had learned what happens when you're wrong about that. Nadia kissed her daughter's forehead and breathed in the warmth of her. The storm was over. Not because the powerful man had fallen, though he had, completely. Not because the coward doctor was mopping floors, though he was. But because she was here, in this room, with her daughter breathing softly in her arms and her brother standing quietly at the door, and the world outside had no